So thanks everybody for tuning in. Yes, today talking about a couple of related projects that focus on the consequences of perceived polarization. Normally when we hear about polarization, the prevailing narrative that we hear is that in its various forms, polarization has been increasing over the past few decades. And at the center of this narrative is, of course, the United States. So let's start there. Much of the research to date on polarization has been conducted in the United States. And here we have data from the Pew Research Center from 1994, looking at the overlap in political values endorsed by Democrat and Republican voters. So you can see there is a fair amount of overlap there. We've got the dark blue shaded area, which represents shared values. Fast forward to 2017, and according to Pew Research Center, there's been a pretty dramatic shift so that dark blue shaded areas reduced quite substantially. This trend is perhaps more apparent when we look at the ideology of House candidates. So these are elected officials from 1980 to 2018. And we can see over this time, there's been a pretty steady growing intensity of that gap between the values endorsed by these candidates. And this is probably in line with what we saw in the States recently with the passing of the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. So at the time, a majority of Americans were in favor of the bill, but Republicans in both chambers opposed it unanimously. But when we zoom out and look beyond the United States, the evidence is maybe not as straightforward as that. So this is data on affective polarization. So that's the extent to which partisans dislike and distrust members of opposing parties. So this is 9 countries from around 1980 to in the 2010s. So yeah, we do see increases in the US, Canada, Switzerland, and a slight increase in New Zealand. Australia remains pretty steady, maybe a slight decrease there. And we do see significant decreases in Britain, Norway, Sweden, and Germany. So this is just a 9-country snapshot, but this doesn't exactly align with that narrative of rapidly growing polarization. And when we focus in on issues that are often key sources of division in society, there's evidence that there's increased agreement and harmony over time. So this is data from Australia, looking at LGBT rights and belief that climate change is occurring over the past few years. And yeah, we see greater consensus on these issues. So if we see greater consensus on these important issues, we have less polarization. So while this narrative of increasing polarization remains quite popular, and the reality of objective polarization is up for debate, researchers have begun focusing on something slightly different, and that is our subjective understandings of the political, attitudinal, and moral differences that exist in society, so perceived polarization. From a social identity perspective, I think the importance and potential consequences of this form of polarization are quite predictable. But when it comes to empirical evidence, we really have some way to go in understanding the drivers, processes, and consequences of this form of polarization. So this is what I've been focusing on for the past few years. And I think so far I've found some evidence that it can help us explain the recent rise in strong-arm populist leaders, which I guess this sort of leader has been the focus in this line of research. But I also think it can help us explain the rise of different forms of strong leaders. So not just right-wing leaders, but also left-wing leaders that equally promise to shake up the current political systems. And I think it may also help us explain examples of social and political unrest. So like we saw in the States with the insurrection attempt on the 6th of January. So I think the consequences of perceived polarization may be particularly relevant in the context of elections and periods of social change. And I'll talk about why that may be the case and the evidence I've got so far. So why is it important to focus on perceived polarization? Well, we know that when an in-group becomes an important and central part of somebody's self-concept, the process of social categorization ensures that group differences are accentuated. So this strengthens this us versus them mindset. Now, according to the comparative fit principle, polarization can really be understood as the consequence of emphasizing intergroup differences and downplaying intragroup differences. So it's all about this meta contrast. And as a result, we frequently believe our group members hold more extreme ideologies than they actually do. And we also consistently overestimate the levels of polarization between different social groups in society. So when this drive for group distinction becomes quite strong, I would argue that objective levels or the actual reality of polarization between groups becomes less relevant. In terms of what we know so far, not all that much. We do have evidence that perceived polarization is linked to negative evaluations of art groups, reduced trust and efficacy in society. It's also associated with increased political engagement. And both effective polarization and online news consumption have been found to increase perceived polarization. Theoretically, it's been linked to the rise of populism, and we've argued that it can undermine responses to a crisis like COVID-19. But perhaps most importantly, perceived polarization has been found to be a stronger predictor of negative consequences than actual polarization in society. Now, I'm going to tweak things just a little bit further as I start heading towards close towards my own research. So yes, I've been interested in perceived polarization, but I've been focusing to begin with on morally charged perceived polarization. And I think it has the potential to be even more damaging. So we know that morality is central to our collective identities, and the moral values that we endorse are developed in conjunction with our groups. So I said that perceived polarization involves this process of comparative fit, but we've argued that unique to moral polarization, the challenges to our moral convictions enhance not only comparative fit, but also normative fit. So when we face contexts where the central moral values of a group are challenged or they clash, more extreme group members should rise and gain in relative prototypicality over those who endorse more moderate values. So this ensures that the group has a greater chance of overcoming the threat, in this case to their moral values, and perceived norms around what best defines the group become more extreme. So in this way, we've argued that moral polarization is this highly charged and particularly potent form of polarization where us versus them really translates and becomes good versus evil. We also know mostly from research conducted by Linda Skidker and her colleagues, that there are unique consequences when our moral convictions clash. So we tend to become highly emotional, willing to act. We're incredibly stubborn, so we refuse to shift our positions. And there's evidence that it leads to damaging intergroup consequences. So increased intergroup hostility, reduced cooperation, and increased acceptance of violence to achieve desired ends. So part of this is because these moral convictions are held with such extreme significance and certainty. So they become our moral mandates, we cherish them, and we're highly motivated to defend them. So this is the type of polarization I've been really interested in exploring. So it's the sense that opposing groups in society hold incompatible moral views, and a process which should ensure greater divergence of views over time. So this is in line with recent theoretical work by Norris and Inglehart, looking at cultural backlash, arguing that group conflict arising from the perceived incompatibility of moral values over time leads to substantial social and political consequences. So the basic thinking is that perceived incompatibility of moral values in society and the fear that a group has that their cherished moral values and standards are being eroded, this will lead to the perceived breakdown of society, and as a result, the desire for substantial political change. So I'll start off with these two predictions leading on from that. So when facing the threat of moral polarization, groups will look to elect a strong leader who promises to champion the sacred values of a group and restore the moral status of a group. As I suggested, we also predicted that higher moral polarization would lead to conditions of societal enemy, at least the perception of those conditions. So the perceived breakdown of social fabric and the perceived breakdown of leadership. And this would be a crucial mediating factor. So in the context of high moral polarization, and this is getting into our second hypothesis here, people may perceive the erosion of social and moral standards and the failure of current political leaders to protect those standards. So we'll see an increased desire to install leaders who represent more extreme moral positions in order to restore the moral and social order in society. So we tested these predictions initially across 3 samples in Australia, the UK, and the US. Shout out to Hema and Yolanda, who are my co-authors on this work so far. And this work just got a revise and resubmit at Political Psych. So this was our primary measure of perceived moral polarization. We asked participants to imagine that these circles represented the core moral values held by left-leaning and right-leaning voters in Australia. So essentially the core values that determined their attitudes towards important social and moral issues. So pretty basic question, to what extent do they think the core moral values overlap in current society? We also measured perceived enemy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So this includes 2 subscales, so the perceived breakdown of social fabric and the perceived breakdown of leadership. And we also adapted Sprong's recent support for strong leaders measure. So the original scale broadly captures support for a right-leaning authoritarian strong leader without making it too explicit. So our new version included 2 subscales. The first, we altered some of the original items and included 5 in total that captured support for an authoritarian strong leader. So our country needs a strong leader who's willing to break the rules. Our country needs a strong authoritarian leader right now. And also 5 items that captured support for a progressive strong leader. So our country needs a strong leader who's willing to challenge the elites and wealthy corporations, and one who is willing to fight for progressive values. So the scale is 10 items in total. It broke down exactly as we were hoping for via factor analysis. So we had 2 clean factors, and this held across Australia, the UK, and the US, which was nice. What did we find? Well, direct links between moral polarization and support for strong leaders was pretty inconsistent across our 3 samples. But we did consistently find that higher perceived moral polarization was linked to increased perceptions of enemy. So both the breakdown of social fabric and the breakdown of leadership. And in all 3 samples, so the UK, Australia, and the US, we found support for our second hypothesis and our proposed mediation model. So this is controlling for political conservatism. Now, we didn't make specific predictions about the different roles the enemy subscales might play, but we did find something interesting. So via the breakdown of social fabric, we saw an indirect effect whereby higher perceived moral polarization led to increased support for an authoritarian strong leader. And via the breakdown of leadership, we saw increased support for a progressive strong leader. So this suggests that the form of enemy that results from perceived moral polarization may lead to different support, or at least support for different types of strong leaders. Our post hoc reasoning for this was that authoritarian leaders tend to thrive on a platform of conflict and asserting those us versus them dynamics, and strong leaders, progressive strong leaders tend to platform on a campaign of unity. So it may be that perceived breakdown of social fabric in response to high levels of moral polarization may be linked to an increased desire to elect an authoritarian strong leader to really restore that social order. But if moral polarization promotes the feeling that leadership in society has been failing, we may look to elect a progressive strong leader in order to promote unity and push the country in a new direction. So as I said, these indirect effects were found in the UK, then replicated in Australia and the US. But as was recently pointed out by reviewers, which is something I definitely agree with, the context being examined here surely would have high relevance, particularly the type of leader currently in power within each country. This is, it'd be interesting to see to what extent these indirect effects hold in different contexts, and that's something I would like to explore. So next, we wanted to test these effects experimentally. We first tried doing this in the US by manipulating perceptions of polarization, but long story short, it didn't really work. So similar to what Yolanda and others have found trying to manipulate perceptions of inequality, people tend to have pretty fixed ideas about the levels of polarization in society. That's at least what we saw in our study in the US. So again, similar to the work on perceived inequality, we created a fictional society. So welcome to Arinthia. So as part of our experiment, we told participants they were becoming a citizen of Arinthia, which was pretty similar to the countries we had examined correlationally. So it was Western society, relatively wealthy. So we introduced them to the two main political parties and said they would have to join one of the two. So the Arinthian Alliance was the more left-leaning political party, and the Arinthian National Party was the more right-leaning party. So in the high polarization condition, we highlighted that there was substantial differences in the core moral values endorsed by both politicians and voters. And this was increasing over time. In the low polarization condition, we highlighted that there was considerable overlap in these core moral values. We also gave them an idea of what this looked like in terms of actual policy positions. So this is from the high moral polarization condition. So on key issues, we saw pretty clear differences in the policies that these two parties were platforming on. And in the low polarization condition, there was much more overlap in these policies. So we presented this manipulation to participants, and then they completed the same measures as in the correlational studies, so support for strong leaders and perceived enemy. So controlling for political conservatism, we saw significant main effects of our manipulation on support for both types of strong leaders. So those in the high polarization condition reported stronger desire to elect both a progressive and an authoritarian strong leader. So these are the direct effects that didn't emerge in the correlational studies. And in terms of our mediation model, we did see some differences from our correlational studies. So again, the indirect effect emerged whereby polarization predicted enhanced support for an authoritarian strong leader via the breakdown of social fabric. But we also saw reduced support for an authoritarian strong leader via the breakdown of leadership, which is not something that emerged in the previous studies. And we also saw a really strong direct link between moral polarization and support for a progressive strong leader. So that indirect effect via the breakdown of leadership didn't emerge this time. So some slight inconsistencies with the indirect effects, again, I think perhaps due to contextual factors, but we did see a somewhat consistent pattern emerge in that the breakdown of social fabric was associated with the increased desire to elect this strong authoritarian leader who might want to restore order, and less support for that kind of leadership direction via the breakdown of leadership. But yeah, as I said, important to examine to what extent these pathways hold in different contexts, especially beyond weird contexts, which I would love to examine. Okay, before I get to questions, I want to talk about some results from a related project, which examined anticipated polarization in the context of national elections. So here in the lead up to the recent Dutch and US elections, we looked at the correlates of anticipated polarization in the context of losing the election. So a future society in which the outgroup candidate has won. So this is work that we're just about to submit. So by their very nature, elections are periods where we see increased conflict and divisions in society. And this is often fueled by political leaders themselves. So during these moments in history, when I would argue polarization between groups is particularly salient, we were wondering how the anticipation of enhanced us versus them enhanced us versus them conflict post-election might increase the expected negative consequences of losing the election. So increased concerns about the future of society and the likelihood of conflict. So we explored these relationships in the lead up to 2 national elections. So these are the measures that we looked at. So anticipated polarization post-election. So the US will become increasingly polarized in the coming years. We measured perceived enemy again. We also measured collective angst, the expectation of conflict. So the US is heading towards a second civil war, and the obligation to fight to overturn the election. So citizens have a moral obligation to fight to overturn this election outcome. Which, as it turned out, became pretty relevant given what happened on the 6th of January. So starting out with the US election, so data collection took place on the 1st of November, so just a few days before the election. We recruited an equal number of Democrat and Republican voters and randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions. So one in which Donald Trump has won the election, and the other in which Joe Biden. So we said we want you to imagine a future in which Donald Trump or Joe Biden wins the 2020 presidential election. Specifically, we want you to imagine it's a week after the election and Trump or Biden has won. We then had an open-ended question, asked them about how they felt about this. And so with this respective future in mind, participants then completed our measures. These are our main 2 predictions. So high anticipated polarization will enhance the expected negative consequences of losing an election. So we'd see increased collective angst, the perceived likelihood of conflict, and the perceived obligation to overturn the election outcome. So essentially with hypothesis 1, we're expecting to see a series of 3-way interactions. So election prime, political orientation, and anticipated polarization. And we again predicted that these effects would be mediated by perceived enemy. Okay, so as we expected, higher anticipated polarization post-election was associated with increased enemy. So both the breakdown of leadership and the breakdown of social fabric, higher collective angst, increased likelihood of civil war, and a stronger obligation to overturn the election. In terms of our first hypothesis. So we found support for our first hypothesis across all three of our outcome variables. So we saw significant three-way interactions. I will take you through these. There's a lot here. So this is first looking at collective angst. Low polarization is on the left-hand side here. So when anticipated polarization was low, there was no change in collective angst among liberals. However, the prospect of losing the election enhanced collective angst among conservatives. But in line with hypothesis one, when anticipated polarization was high, the prospect of losing the election was associated with increased collective angst among both liberals and conservatives. So the right-hand side of the graph. The likelihood of civil war. So when anticipated polarization was low, there was no association between losing the election and the perceived likelihood of civil war. However, both liberals and conservatives reported an increased likelihood of America descending into civil war if the outgroup won the election when polarization was high. And obligation to overturn the election. So when anticipated polarization was low, we still did see an effect whereby liberals and conservatives reported an obligation to overturn the election if the outgroup candidate won. But in line with our first hypothesis, when anticipated polarization was high, the strength of this effect increased among both liberals and conservatives. So basically, we found that participants expected more negative consequences when the outgroup leader has won the election. That makes sense. That wasn't surprising. But higher anticipated polarization post-election really amplified these effects. In terms of our second hypothesis, we found support for that in terms of our proposed mediation model. So perceived enemy mediated all of these outcome variables, but this only occurred via the breakdown of leadership and not the breakdown of social fabric. So in hindsight, this made sense, given participants were being asked to consider the consequences of new political leadership, and it was really the perceived breakdown in this leadership that was the crucial mechanism leading to these effects. Okay, we wanted to also test these predictions outside of a two-party political system. So a few months later, we tested them again in the context of the Dutch 2021 general election. So this was just held last month. So in the Netherlands, there's a multi-party system. So we have a much larger number of political parties vying for representative power. To give you an idea, in 2017, 13 parties won seats in the House of Reps. And not since the late 19th century has a single party won enough seats to govern in its own right. So the first study, participants were randomly assigned to consider a future in which a left-leaning or a right-leaning coalition took power following the election. So data collection took place in February in the lead up to the election in March, and special thanks to Frank for helping with these translations. So again, in line with study one, we saw higher anticipated polarization was associated with increased anomie, higher collective angst, increased likelihood of civil war in Dutch society, and increased perceived obligation to overturn the election. Also in line with study one, we saw significant three-way interactions on collective angst and obligation to overturn the election, not on the perceived likelihood of civil war. So we just saw the direct effects there. I'll take you through these again. So this is collective angst. So when anticipated polarization was low, an outgroup election victory was associated with heightened collective angst for those low but not high in conservatism. In contrast, when anticipated polarization was high, prospect of losing the 2021 election predicted increased collective angst for both liberals and conservatives. obligation to overturn the election when anticipated polarization was low. Losing the election did not predict changes in the perceived obligation to overturn among liberals or conservatives, but when anticipated polarization was high, losing the election predicted an enhanced obligation among liberals to overturn the election outcome. And among conservatives, high polarization, we saw an enhanced obligation to overturn the election no matter which side won, which was interesting. Our mediation model came through again. So once again, it was via the perceived breakdown of leadership and not via the perceived breakdown of social fabric. Again, all three outcome variables. And so though the effects in the Netherlands were somewhat weaker than in the US, but I think given how extreme some of these outcome variables were, it was pretty telling that by and large, these effects replicated in a context far removed from the US. Okay, implications so far. I'll talk about both projects. So I think there's further evidence of the negative social and political consequences of perceived polarization, particularly morally charged polarization. We've uncovered crucial ties between perceived polarization and societal anomie, including how different forms of anomie might predict support for distinct types of strong leaders. So again, there was initial evidence that via the breakdown of social fabric in society, moral polarization might predict increased support for an authoritarian strong leader, and via the perceived breakdown of leadership, increased support for a progressive. Again, context is important. I'd love to explore these indirect effects in different contexts. I think there's also evidence to suggest that perceived polarization can really has the power to cause substantial social unrest, particularly in the context of elections and periods of social change. So I think this highlights the importance of being aware of the consequences of political figures who really thrive on tactics of increased tensions and division, tactics that we often see employed by populist leaders. So this is further evidence, adding to what we already know, that this might have the capacity to seriously undermine standards of democracy. I think this is just the beginning of this research program. I think there's a lot of potential here. As I said, moving forward, I want to examine these processes and effects in more diverse contexts. I've spoken about the unique nature of morally charged polarization, but empirically, this distinction from, say, standard political polarization needs to be tested. And all of this is linked to a wider research program examining the drivers, processes, consequences, and solutions to particularly morally charged polarization. That was part of my recent DECRA proposal, and I hope to carry much of this research out with or without a DECRA. Okay, thank you. A special shout out again to Yolanda and Hamer, my main collaborators on this work.